You have one choice. Take the deal. And if I refuse, you know what happens.
Smoke sat low in the Harlem backroom, thick enough to turn the light dirty. Men crowded the walls, shoulders pressed to peeling wallpaper, their laughter too loud for a place with only one door. The table in the center had been scarred 100 times by cards, bottles, and promises. Tonight it waited for a different kind of mark. The knife came down so hard the wood jumped. It stuck there, quivering inches from Bumpy Johnson's hand, like the point was still deciding where to bite. A hush should have followed. Instead, the man who threw it filled the room with his own voice. He was dressed loud, shiny shoes, bright tie, a grin that needed witnesses. He talked about respect the way small men talk about money. He wasn't just threatening Bumpy. He was performing dominance for everyone who might repeat the story later. "Look at that," he said, leaning in. "Ain't even flinch." He wanted a twitch, a curse, a scramble backward, anything he could frame as fear. His boys shifted behind him, ready to laugh on cue, ready to move if the room tipped. Even the bartender stopped wiping the same glass. Bumpy didn't touch the knife. He didn't touch his drink. He didn't even look at the blade. He kept his palm flat on the table, relaxed, as if the steel had landed in a different world. His face gave nothing away, no insult, no surrender, not even curiosity. Silence sat on him like a tailored coat. And in a room trained to read men, that quiet made the threat feel heavier, inevitable. The loud man kept talking because he couldn't stand what he couldn't control. He stacked words like bricks, building a wall that only proved he was afraid of what might be on the other side. Every sentence was a dare. Every laugh was borrowed. He leaned closer, close enough for Bumpy to catch liquor through sweet cologne. Bumpy finally lifted his eyes. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough. The room tightened. Someone swallowed. A chair creaked and then went still, like even the furniture knew better. The enemy mistook that glance for permission. He reached for the knife, fingers spreading, ready to pull it out and make the next move loud as well. Bumpy's hand still didn't move. But the air did. And for the first time all night, the man's grin hesitated, because he realized the danger wasn't the blade in the table. Nobody in that room understood why he held back, and that question was the sharpest thing there. It was the restraint sitting beside it, waiting to choose how and when the room would pay for the noise. Nobody moved. Everybody waited for the part they understood, the shout, the slap, the scramble for the door. The knife was supposed to be a trigger, not a question. The loud man kept his hand hovering over the handle, grinning at the room like he'd just written the ending. Bumpy Johnson didn't give him that ending. He pushed his chair back, one small scrape that sliced through the smoke. Then he stood, not fast, not hesitant, but slow enough to prove he owned the seconds. His eyes never went to the blade. They went past it, past the man, past the whole act, like he was already living in the next hour while everyone else was trapped in this one. The enemy laughed, sharp and triumphant, and the room joined in half a beat later. It wasn't joy. It was relief. Men laugh when they think the storm has missed them. Bumpy took his coat from the chair. Put it on. Buttoned it. Each motion quiet, deliberate. No words. In Harlem, words were cheap. The expensive thing was what you made people imagine when you didn't speak. He stepped around the table, close enough for the loud man to bump him on purpose. The man leaned in anyway, trying to force a reaction, trying to reclaim center stage. But Bumpy didn't look at him. Not a glare. Not a warning. Not even acknowledgement. The absence of attention landed like an insult you couldn't hit back. The laughter thinned. The loud man's grin kept working, but it started to look heavy. Bumpy reached the door and paused. Not because he was unsure. Because pauses make other men unsure. He let the room hear its own breathing. He let the knife sit there, still stuck in the wood, a threat with no payoff. Then he left. The door shut with a soft click. The enemy threw his hands wide, louder now, feeding on the echo. "That's right," he said. "Walk away." But the room didn't clap. Men glanced at the knife, then at each other, as if the table had become a witness stand. Something had shifted and nobody could name it. The loud man had the room, but not the moment. And that was the first humiliation, quiet, already spreading, because everyone could feel it. Whatever Bumpy's real move was, it hadn't happened yet. Not tonight. Outside that back room, Harlem kept moving like it always did, like it hadn't just watched a man refuse to blink. Night air cut the smoke off Bumpy's coat as soon as he hit the sidewalk. A saxophone spilled out of a basement club. A street vendor hissed hot chestnuts into paper cones. Somewhere uptown, a church door closed and a dice game opened, the city passing its own currency hand to hand. Whispers, favors, fear. Harlem had rules. Not the ones written in law books, but the ones everybody obeyed if they wanted to wake up in the morning. You paid the right men. You kept your mouth tight. You didn't embarrass somebody unless you were prepared to replace them. And you never forgot who really owned the pipes, who the cops answered to, who the judges owed, who controlled the trucks that brought liquor and number slips and guns in through the dark. In those years, power in Harlem was a balancing act on a wire. Black operators ran the street-level engines, the policy banks, the clubs, the protection, the introductions. They knew the corners, the families, the hunger. But above them floated white mob interests like a shadow with money, men who didn't live there but collected from it, who treated Harlem like a territory on a map, not a home with consequences. Between the two was the system. Uniforms for sale, badges that turned their heads for the right envelope, politicians smiling for photographs while their pockets got fat on the same misery they pretended to condemn. Most men thought survival meant choosing a side and keeping it. Bumpy wasn't most men. He understood that the sides were props. Structures were the real weapons. A man could throw a punch and win a moment. A man could bend a structure and win a decade. That's what the knife in the table really was. It wasn't about steel. It was about permission. The loud man wanted the room to believe he could disrespect Bumpy and still walk out under his own name. He wanted Harlem to see a crack and rush to widen it. Because when a calm man is made to look small, everybody who profits from order starts shopping for a new ruler. Bumpy didn't answer with blood because blood would have made it personal. Personal was easy to contain. Personal could be forgiven, negotiated, misunderstood. But what happened in that room wasn't personal. It was political. It was a test run for a new arrangement. Who gets to speak loud? Who gets to collect quiet? Who gets to show their face in public without paying for it? Harlem was about to learn the difference between a man who reacts and a man who plans. And the men laughing behind that knife were about to learn something worse. The moment you think you've humiliated a king is usually the moment he starts redesigning the whole board. No sirens. Just consequences. He told it in barbershops, in hallways outside card games, in the back of clubs where the music was just loud enough to hide names. He acted out the knife slam with his whole arm, made sure the blade landed in the air inches from an imaginary hand. He added extra laughter where none had been. He exaggerated the pause at the door like it was fear, like Bumpy Johnson had searched the room for help and found none. Men nodded. Men smiled. Men let him talk. Because in Harlem, you don't correct a man when he's building his own coffin. You just step aside and watch what he chooses to hammer shut. His mistake wasn't the knife. The knife was theater. His mistake was thinking that noise was power. Noise is what you use when you need the room to hold you up. It's what you borrow when you don't trust your own weight. He believed intimidation was control because people backed up when he raised his voice. He believed an audience meant allegiance. He believed a story, repeated enough times, could become reality. And he believed Bumpy's silence was emptiness, an absence he could fill with his own legend. But silence wasn't empty on Bumpy. Silence was loaded. Bumpy had grown up in a world where men smiled while they measured you, where handshakes were agreements and also warnings. He'd seen impulsive men die young and loud, their funerals packed with people who swore they were good dudes, right before they took their corners. He'd seen the law used like a club against the poor and like a shield for the connected. He learned early that if you wanted to last, you didn't just learn violence. You learned memory. And Bumpy's memory wasn't sentimental. It was operational. He remembered who had done right by him, sure, who had fed him when he was broke, who had kept their word when nobody was watching. But he also remembered slights the way a banker remembers debts. Not out of emotion. Out of discipline. In his mind, disrespect wasn't a bruise. It was a signal. A public challenge that, left unanswered, became a precedent. And in Harlem, precedent was destiny. That's what the loud man didn't understand. He thought he'd embarrassed Bumpy in private. But he'd done it in public. In front of men who watched power like gamblers watch cards. In front of men who would retell it with little twists until the city believed Bumpy could be tested. That kind of disrespect wasn't something you got over. It was something that spread. In Bumpy's code, you could fight a man and still do business later. You could even steal from a man if you were brave enough to deal with the math afterward. But public humiliation? That was different. Humiliation was an attempt to take your name. And a man without a name in Harlem was just an opportunity. So while the loud man performed his victory, Bumpy did what he always did when the room thought he'd left the game. He listened. He let the story travel. He watched who repeated it with enthusiasm and who repeated it with caution. He noted who laughed too hard, who looked away, who suddenly got brave enough to mention his name without honor in their voice. The enemy mistook patience for paralysis. He mistook the lack of immediate retaliation for forgiveness. He started walking a little taller, showing his face a little more, stepping into places he used to wait outside. He didn't realize he wasn't expanding. He was exposing. Because Bumpy didn't need to rush. The disrespect had already done the work for him. It had made the enemy careless. It had made the city talk. It had created a line in the sand so clear that when Bumpy finally moved, nobody would call it a surprise. They'd call it inevitable. Bumpy Johnson didn't replay the knife in his head like a frightened man. He replayed the room, the faces, the pauses, the way laughter arrived late, like men were asking permission to breathe. He remembered the distance between steel and skin because distance separates a threat from an insult, and that night the insult had been measured. He walked Harlem with the same stillness he'd worn at the table, letting the city flash and shout around him. A boy sprinted past with newspapers. 2 cops leaned on a corner, watching everybody and nothing. Chaos, noise, motion. Harlem loved motion. Bumpy loved control. It kept him alive, others didn't. His rules were simple, but they were not soft. Respect wasn't politeness. Respect was structure. It was the invisible agreement that kept men from turning every disagreement into a funeral. You didn't surprise a man in public. You didn't corner him for sport. You didn't harvest laughs off his name. Because then you weren't testing temper, you were testing the order he held together. That order had been bought the hard way. Betrayal taught him what affection couldn't. Friends turned into witnesses. Partners turned into rivals. Smiles turned into paperwork. He'd watched men rush toward revenge and get caught in the part they couldn't see, the trap behind the insult, the police behind the gun, the hungry newcomer behind the handshake. The street punished impulse quickly, without emotion. So Bumpy trained himself to move like a man who could afford to wait. Waiting wasn't weakness. Waiting was scouting. It was letting the other man show you who he was when he thought you weren't watching. It was letting arrogance spend itself. A loud enemy always wants a reaction because a reaction gives him a rhythm. Once he has your rhythm, he can predict you. Once he can predict you, he can set you up. That's why impulsive violence was beneath Bumpy. A punch is a confession. A gunshot is an announcement. It tells the room you're ruled by the same heat that rules every reckless fool in the city. Bumpy didn't want to be feared like a mad dog. He wanted to be feared like weather, quiet, unavoidable, arriving on a schedule only he could read. Inside his mind, everything had a place. Anger was a tool, not a master. Pride was a mask, not an engine. He could feel the disrespect like a bruise under a suit, but he refused to scratch it in public. Let the enemy itch for applause. Let him confuse attention for loyalty. Let him mistake a calm man for a tired one. Because calm is what you wear when you're already deciding. Calm is how you make chaos reveal itself. The enemy had walked into that back room thinking power was volume. Bumpy knew power was silence, the kind that makes men fill it with their own mistakes. And when Bumpy finally moved, it wouldn't be to satisfy anger. It would be to restore the structure the knife tried to crack. Precise. A lesson delivered so thoroughly that the next man would think twice before raising his voice. Harlem could keep spinning loud around him. In Bumpy's head, the board was already set. The only question left was which piece the enemy would sacrifice first. Bumpy didn't call a meeting. Meetings were for men who needed the room to witness their authority. He moved the way he always moved when something needed fixing. Through people, through habits, through the small seams in Harlem that only showed when you pressed on them. He started with a walk that looked like nothing. Same corners. Same calm stride. A stop at a barbershop where nobody asked questions out loud. A nod to a club owner who owed him more than money. A handshake that lasted half a second too long, just long enough to deliver a message without words. Stay close, stay quiet. Then the conversations began. Not speeches. Murmurs. 2 sentences, maybe 3. One man was told to hold a delivery an extra day. Another was told to be out of town when a certain request came in. A bartender was asked who had been buying drinks for strangers. A numbers runner was asked who'd been paying too early, too eager. The answers came back like smoke, slow, curling, hard to grab, but you could smell where it had been. Bumpy didn't correct the rumor about the knife. He let it live. Let it swell. Let it become a story men argued over. Some said he'd walked away because he was scared. Others said he'd walked away because he was angry. Both versions served him. Fear would make people test him. Anger would make people brace. Either way, the enemy would start making decisions under pressure. And men under pressure always reveal their weak side. He repositioned allies the way you shift weight on a crowded subway car. Subtle, efficient, nobody noticing until the balance changes. A friend who usually handled a certain block stepped back for a week. Another man stepped in, someone the enemy didn't know well enough to bully. A club that had been neutral suddenly stopped letting the loud man's boys loiter at the door. No confrontation. Just a new bouncer with a polite smile and a firm hand on the velvet rope. Next came the money. Not the big money, the kind that attracts eyes and headlines. The small money that keeps men loyal. Credit at the bar. The backroom tab. The quiet loans that float a gambler through a bad run. The enemy had been feeding his ego with those little comforts, building a circle of paid laughter. Bumpy didn't need to attack him. He just needed to interrupt the flow. A butcher stopped extending a favor. A landlord became strict about rent. A tailor suddenly required cash up front. The kind of inconveniences you can explain away individually, bad timing, new policy, tough week. The kind of inconveniences that, stacked together, start to feel like the city itself is turning its shoulder. The enemy didn't notice at first. He still had his voice. He still had the story. He still had a few men eager to be seen at his side. But the city began to treat him differently in ways he couldn't punch. Calls didn't get returned as fast. Smiles got thinner. Information arrived late. Bumpy leaned on the pressure points that never left bruises. A police lieutenant who liked to act unpredictable suddenly became very predictable, showing up at the enemy's places at the worst moments, asking harmless questions with hungry eyes. A clerk downtown lost a permit. A shipment of liquor took the scenic route and arrived light. Not enough to start a war. Enough to start blaming. That was the goal. Not destruction. Division. Because a loud man survives by keeping everyone looking in the same direction, at him. Bumpy made them look at each other. He let suspicion bloom in the enemy's circle like mold. Who told Bumpy? Who's not solid? Who's getting paid twice? When your world is built on intimidation, the first time your own people start whispering, you're already bleeding. And through it all, Bumpy stayed visible in the quietest way, present, composed, never frantic, never bragging. He didn't raise his voice to prove he was still standing. He didn't need to. His calm became a rumor of its own. By the time the enemy finally sensed the shift, he would feel it as a kind of loneliness. The room still laughed, but the laughter was thin. The drinks still poured, but they cost more. The corners still belonged to someone, but it wasn't clear anymore who. That's when Bumpy's net did its real work. Because once a man starts moving out of panic, he stops checking where he steps. And Harlem had already been arranged to make sure the next step was the wrong one. Day 1, the loud man woke up still tasting last night's victory. He walked into Harlem like he owned the sidewalk, expecting heads to turn, expecting smiles to greet him first. A couple did. Most didn't. The first thing he noticed was how quick conversations ended when he approached, like a hand had squeezed the air out of the block. Day 2, money got strange. A runner who usually paid on time said the take was short. A bar that always floated his tab asked for cash. A girl who liked his attention suddenly had plans. None of it screamed danger. That was the problem. Danger is easier when it announces itself. Day 3, his boys started drifting. Not leaving, not openly. Just arriving late. Just not laughing as hard. One of them mentioned Bumpy's name like a weather report, flat, careful, and the loud man snapped at him too fast. The room went quiet. He heard it then. The silence didn't fear him. It judged him. Day 4, the police showed up twice. Same questions, different faces. Everything all right in here? They asked, smiling like men checking a lock. The loud man paid them off, but the price was higher than usual, and the hand that took the money didn't bother to hide the smirk. He went looking for allies, flashing money and threats, but men smiled and stayed non-committal, eyes flicking away like they'd seen a ghost. Day 5, a door closed. A club owner he'd been sure he had in his pocket claimed the place was private tonight. No argument, just the rope pulled across the entrance and a new bouncer staring through him. The loud man stood there too long, waiting for someone to recognize his authority. Nobody did. People walked around him like he was a parked car. Day 6, the whispers turned sharp. Somebody said he was being set up. Somebody said he'd already been sold out. Somebody said Bumpy Johnson had been seen with men the loud man didn't trust. The loud man tried to trace the talk back to its source and found only more talk. Every question he asked returned as a suspicion. Why you asking? Who you scared of? Who you trying to blame? And Bumpy stayed unseen. That was the worst part. No threats. No messengers. No warning. Just absence, like the city had decided not to include him anymore. The loud man started sleeping in pieces, waking to every sound. He checked his window twice. He kept a pistol close, then hated himself for needing it. Day 7, he realized he had been counting without meaning to. He could feel the clock in his ribs, ticking with each loss. Respect first, then money, then friends, then the illusion of safety. By morning he had nowhere to go that felt clean. By afternoon he had too many places to hide and none that felt loyal. That evening, someone finally asked him a simple question. You heard from Bumpy? The loud man forced a laugh. It came out thin. In the space after it, Harlem held its breath, because everyone could sense it now. The collision wasn't coming loud. It was coming precise. And whatever mercy the loud man imagined living inside silence had already run out. The back room looked smaller without laughter. Same scarred table, same low ceiling stained by years of smoke, but the air felt rinsed, expectant. The knife was still there, buried in the wood where it had landed days ago. Nobody had pulled it out. Nobody wanted to touch the story. The enemy came in alone. Not because he planned it. Harlem had arranged it. Friends remembering errands, muscles suddenly unavailable, doors suddenly closed. He paused in the doorway, pride searching for an audience that wasn't coming. The few men inside didn't greet him. They treated him like a problem they didn't want to inherit. He walked to the table anyway. His hand hovered near the knife like a man reaching for a railing on a high stair. The old bravado tried to rise, but it had nowhere to stand. His jokes felt dangerous in his mouth now. So he swallowed them. Then the chair across from him scraped back. Bumpy Johnson sat there as if he'd been there the whole time, coat neat, face calm, eyes level. No entourage. No announcement. Just presence, quiet enough to make every sound feel like evidence. The enemy flinched and hated himself for it. Bumpy didn't look at the knife. He looked at the man. Silence came first, heavy and exact. It wasn't awkward. It was chosen. The enemy tried to speak, something about misunderstandings, about respect, about squaring things. The words rushed, desperate to fill the space Bumpy refused to rent him. Bumpy lifted one finger. Not a threat. A correction. The enemy stopped mid-sentence, shocked at how quickly he obeyed. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. You wanted a room, he said, voice low enough to make the enemy lean in. Now you got one. No shouting. No cursing. Just a line that landed like a hand on the back of the neck. The enemy's cheeks warmed, not from rage, from understanding. The knife hadn't been the weapon. The weapon had been the waiting, the city turning its face away, the slow theft of certainty. Bumpy had stripped him down to his breathing. Bumpy placed his palm on the table, near the trembling handle. Close enough to claim it without touching it. That thing, he murmured, was never for me. The enemy's eyes dropped to the blade like it might rescue him. It didn't. Bumpy stood. The room stood with him, not by command, but by gravity. He reached out and with 2 fingers, pushed the knife deeper into the wood. A small sound. A final punctuation. Then he slid the table an inch toward the enemy, making the knife stop just short of the man's hand. "Take it," Bumpy said. Calm as prayer. The enemy didn't. Couldn't. His fingers stayed curled in his lap, trapped by what taking it would mean. In that refusal, the humiliation landed clean. Everyone saw it. The loud man couldn't even lift his own threat. Bumpy turned for the door, already finished. He didn't need blood to make the point. He needed memory and witnesses tonight. At the threshold he paused, just like before, and let the pause feel like a verdict. Behind him, the room stayed silent. Not because they feared the knife. Because they understood who decided when it would be used. By morning, the story had already changed shape. It moved the way truth does in Harlem, quietly, trimmed of drama, sharpened to a point. Men didn't repeat the threats. They repeated the pause. They talked about the knife still buried in the table, about the man who couldn't lift it, about the calm that settled the room like dust after furniture stops moving. Nobody said the enemy's name loud. That was part of it. Names carry weight, and his had lost some on the walk home. He kept to shadows for a while, then to other neighborhoods, then to memory. When he did appear, it was smaller. Louder men tried to borrow his story and failed. Harlem had already filed it under finished business. Respect returned the way order always does, through understanding, not panic. Club owners reset their rules without speeches. Corners went back to their rhythms. The right envelopes moved again, predictable as tides. Men who'd tested their voices lowered them. Men who'd watched carefully nodded to each other and kept working. The city didn't celebrate. It corrected. What lingered wasn't fear of violence. It was clarity. Everyone understood the cost of public disrespect now, understood that humiliation was the real currency of punishment. You could survive a beating. You could survive a fine. You couldn't survive being seen as a man who reached for steel and came up empty. Bumpy didn't tour the victory. He didn't need to. His presence returned to its usual scale, felt more than seen. That restraint was the lesson. Power that explains itself weakens. Power that moves quietly endures. Harlem read that message the way it reads weather, adjusting coats and plans without complaint. Weeks later, new faces tried to speak loudly, to test the air. Old heads didn't stop them. They just watched. The city has a long memory, and it prefers examples to lectures. When those men asked what happened before them, the answers came simple and consistent. He waited. That was enough. Chaos retreated to its proper corners. The streets breathed easier, not because they were safer, but because they were legible again. Lines were visible. Consequences were clear. In an unforgiving world, that clarity felt like justice. And justice, once understood, kept more peace than any blade ever could. It wasn't mercy that ruled next, it was agreement. Everyone knew where they stood and why. The lesson traveled farther than the block, farther than the night. Order didn't roar back. It settled in, steady, reminding Harlem that patience could still rearrange the world without breaking it. That certainty stayed, guiding hands, lowering voices, keeping knives where they belonged. Long after the smoke cleared. People argued about what Bumpy Johnson did and didn't do, but that argument missed the point. He didn't choose noise. He chose the throat. Not with blood, but with control, the kind that stops a man's future instead of just his breath. In Harlem, that distinction mattered more than morality speeches ever could. Power, to Bumpy, wasn't proven by how fast you reacted. It was proven by how long you could wait without leaking intention. Loud men spent their strength all at once, burning bright and fast, teaching the city exactly where to aim. Bumpy invested his. Every slight earned interest. Every insult matured quietly until repayment became unavoidable. Revenge rushed was just temper. Revenge delayed was structure. He understood something most men learned too late. Reputation does the killing before violence ever arrives. A man known for restraint forces others to imagine the worst, and imagination is cheaper than bullets. It spreads faster. It disciplines entire rooms without a hand being raised. That was why humiliation mattered. It wasn't cruelty. It was calibration. The knife story lasted because it carried a rule. Don't confuse silence for weakness. Don't perform dominance unless you're ready to own the ending. Harlem didn't fear Bumpy because he enjoyed punishment. It respected him because punishment was never random. Consequences followed behavior like a shadow that couldn't be outrun. That legacy outlived the moment. Men adjusted their voices. They chose words carefully. They learned that dignity wasn't something you demanded with steel. It was something you protected with consistency. In Bumpy's world, you could survive being poor. You could survive being scared. You couldn't survive being careless with another man's name. That's why his calm stayed dangerous. It taught a generation that restraint could be sharper than rage, that patience could close doors louder than gunfire. Every move wrote a sentence in a man's reputation, and Harlem read those sentences closely. He left behind a map for anyone willing to read it. Control the moment, and you control the story told afterward. Miss that chance, and the city will finish the sentence for you. Harlem remembered men who shouted, but it followed men who measured. Bumpy knew that survival was an authored thing, rewritten daily, and every choice either fortified your name or signed its expiration. That knowledge separated him from men chasing applause and empty crowns. In the end, Bumpy didn't rule by terror. He ruled by clarity. Everyone knew where the line was, what happened when you crossed it, and how long the city would remember. That understanding saved lives and ended others. Because in his Harlem, power wasn't about striking first. It was about striking exactly where it would never be forgotten.